Morning mist lay over the foothills, like a held breath. Behind a small log cabin, Rebecca Stone worked the thin garden, pulling weeds from cold soil with hands that were green and strong, and never quite warm enough for the altitude. She was 23. Orc. Full orc, though she'd lived her entire life in a human settlement, which meant she'd spent her entire life learning to move through spaces that hadn't been designed for her. Green skin the color of deep pine shadow, amber eyes that caught the light like polished stone, auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid with a worn ribbon. She was young, but worry already lived in her face, not in lines. Orc skin didn't line the way human skin did, but in the set of her jaw and the particular stillness of her expression, the composure of a woman who had learned early that showing too much was a luxury she couldn't afford. Inside the cabin, her father's cough shook the thin walls. Years of chasing gold dust in the mountain claims had ruined his lungs and never paid their debts. He was human, had married an orc woman who died when Rebecca was 11, leaving him with 3 children whose skin told a story he'd never been ashamed of, but that the town had never let him forget. Letters from the bank sat in a tin box by his bed, full of dates and threats Rebecca understood too well. Her younger brother and sister, half orc, lighter green 9 and 7, still ran barefoot through the rocks, laughing like nothing bad could ever happen. Rebecca watched them from the garden and envied the mercy of being too young to count. That night, the wind pushed at the shutters. Rebecca sat by the low fire, mending a torn shirt, while her father stared into the flames. His breathing was shallow, the particular shallow of a man whose lungs had been filling with dust for 15 years, and were now filling with something worse. After a long silence, he told her what she already knew. He could not work the claim much longer. His breath was short. The bank would not wait. She would need to marry a man who could provide, someone strong and steady enough to carry the family through the winter. His voice shook with shame. Not the shame of asking his daughter to marry for duty. That was frontier arithmetic, hard but understood. The shame of knowing that his orc daughter's options were narrower than a human girl's would be. Fewer men would take an orc wife. Fewer families would welcome green grandchildren. The equation that governed Rebecca's life had an additional variable that her father had never been able to remove, no matter how many years he spent treating her as simply his daughter rather than his orc daughter. He didn't say any of this. He didn't have to. They'd been doing this mathematics together since her mother died. Rebecca kept her hands moving on the mending so he wouldn't see them tremble. She didn't want to be traded because of debt. She wanted love, or at least choice. But choice was a currency she'd never been able to accumulate. Not as a miner's daughter, not as an orc, not as the eldest child holding a family together with both hands while everything pushed against them. When her family slept, she sat alone at the rough table with a stub of candle. A borrowed book lay open before her, stories about distant cities and iron railroads, words that made the cabin feel wider for an hour. She imagined a life where she was more than a miner's orc daughter at the end of a dirt road, with a duty mask so firmly in place that she'd forgotten what her face looked like underneath it. The knock came after midnight, not timid, steady, firm. The knock of a person who knew why he stood there. Her father picked up the old rifle and opened the door. A man stood on the porch with frost in his dark beard and moonlight on his shoulders. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", and broad, wrapped in a worn leather coat and canvas trousers that had seen too many mountains. Calm blue eyes looked past the rifle into the room without flinching, the way eyes looked when they've been assessed by worse things than a sick man with a shaking gun. He stepped inside when her father lowered the barrel and took off his hat. He said his name was Caleb. Just Caleb, a mountain man who held land higher up in the range. Word of their trouble had reached him. He was not rich in gold, he said, but he had steady work, strong hands, and a place of his own. If Rebecca chose to be his wife, he would settle the worst of the debts and send enough food and wood to keep her family through the winter. He spoke plain and slow, without charm or fine promises. The cabin went quiet. Her brother and sister watched from the ladder with wide eyes. Her father's cough bent him double, and he had to lean against the table. When her father straightened, wheezing, and asked Caleb what he really wanted, Caleb answered, just as steady. He needed a partner, not a doll, a woman who knew how to work and would stand beside him when storms came. He said he had watched Rebecca in town, hauling sacks at the trading post, arguing for fair weight when the merchant tried to short her, keeping her family together when everything pushed against them. That valley will never admit how strong you are, Caleb said, looking at Rebecca. But I saw it. Then he added, in the same steady voice, I know what I'm asking. I know what it means for an orc woman to marry an outsider she doesn't know. I won't drag you anywhere. The choice is yours alone. The word orc landed in the cabin without apology. He'd said it, not avoided it, not danced around it, not used the careful circumlocutions that polite people employed when they wanted credit for tolerance without actually having to name the thing they were tolerating. He'd said it the way you say a fact, orc woman, and the way he said it carried no weight of judgment, only the weight of acknowledgement that the world would make this harder for her than it would for a human bride. And he knew it, and he was asking anyway. He set his hat back on his head and stepped out into the night. For the next few days, the settlement buzzed with double-layered gossip, the kind that frontier towns produced when two taboos collided. Poor girl. The mountain man wants to marry her. That was the first layer. Pity, the comfortable kind that cost the speaker nothing. A human man taking an orc wife? That was the second, the one spoken in lower tones with raised eyebrows and shaken heads, the one that carried the weight of a social order being tested. Rebecca heard it all. At the trading post, buying flour and salt, counting every coin twice, she felt the looks, the sideways glances, the whispers that stopped when she turned, the one voice she caught saying, "Mixed children," as if the phrase itself were a warning. Caleb came by at dusk and sat on the porch rail while the sky turned deep blue. He didn't push for an answer. He talked about the high country, deep snow, clear water, quiet valleys no one from town ever saw. He talked about the world changing fast, about big companies hunting for untouched timber, about a person either letting it crush them or learning to ride with it. Rebecca listened and said little. She was measuring him, not his words, which were careful and competent, but his silences, which were where the truth lived. A man who talked well could be performing. A man who sat quietly on a porch rail with an orc woman as the town whispered about them was performing nothing. He was just sitting. 2 days later, the creditors arrived. Clean horses, neat coats, flat, hard voices. They named the amount. They talked about taking the claim, the cabin, the mule. When they rode off, dust settled over the yard and her father dropped into his chair, like a man whose legs had stopped holding him. That night, he told Rebecca that Caleb's offer might be the only way to keep the family together. Without help, the bank would take everything. The children would be split up, and split up half-orc children in frontier territory meant the poorhouse or worse. His eyes shone in the firelight. His hands shook. He said he was sorry that his failures had fallen on her shoulders. Later, she climbed to the loft and stood before the cracked bit of mirror nailed to the wall. A tired young orc woman looked back at her, jaw tight, amber eyes shadowed from too many late nights. She was no longer a girl who could wait for life to be kind. She was a woman wearing a duty mask so tightly that it had become her face. She lay awake listening to the wind claw at the roof and the sound of her father's breathing below, labored, rattling, the sound of a man running out of time. Every path she imagined circled back to the same hard truth. At dawn, the peaks turned pale gold under a thin, cold sky. When she stepped onto the porch, Caleb was already there beside a small wagon stacked with sacks and crates. 2 strong horses stamped and blew steam into the chill air. Her brother and sister huddled in the doorway. Her father leaned against the frame, shoulders bowed, eyes fixed on her face. Rebecca's heart pulled in 2 directions. Fear and duty tugged her back toward the doorway. A thin, bright line of hope, or something she couldn't name yet, tugged her toward the wagon and the unknown. She walked down the steps until she stood in front of Caleb. His face was steady and quiet. He didn't smile wide or look away. He simply waited. "I'll go with you," she said, "as your wife." Caleb nodded once, a nod that said he understood what it cost her to say those words, that he wasn't going to pretend it was simple, that he received the weight of her decision with the seriousness it deserved. He held out his hand. Rebecca looked at it, weathered, calloused, human. She placed hers in it, green, strong, orc. The temperature difference was immediate. His warm, hers cool. Both of them felt it. Neither of them mentioned it. He helped her onto the worn wooden seat. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled away from the only home she had ever known, the cabin shrinking behind them until it was just a dark shape against the morning sky. Her sister waved until the trees swallowed the view. Her brother stood with his chin up, trying to look brave in the particular way that 9-year-old boys try to look brave when they understand that something important is happening and they can't stop it. Ahead, a narrow trail climbed toward the high country. Rebecca pulled her shawl tight and stared at the distant peaks. She had married a man who seemed as poor as any miner, for the sake of her family and a small piece of her own hope. The duty mask was firmly in place. Beneath it, she felt nothing she was ready to name. And as the wagon rattled deeper into the mountains and the settlement vanished from sight, a strange feeling settled over her, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to reveal a secret about Caleb and the life he was leading her toward. For 3 days, the trail kept climbing into the high country. The air turned thin and sharp, and every breath felt like it had to fight its way into Rebecca's lungs. Pines crowded the narrow path, and cliffs rose on one side like gray stone walls. Caleb guided the horses with an easy grip on the reins, saying little. His eyes moved constantly, over sky, rock, and trees, with the particular scanning attention of a man who wasn't watching for danger but checking on something familiar. Not a traveler's gaze, an owner's. They stopped beside a narrow creek to rest the team. Caleb built a small fire. In 3 careful moves, hands sure, sequence memorized, the motions of a man who could do this in his sleep, and probably had 1,000 times in 1,000 nights. Rebecca sat on a flat rock with dry bread in her hands and watched him. He looked like any poor mountain man in his patched coat, but nothing about him felt careless. Every rope was coiled with military precision. Every buckle sat where it should. When he checked the horse's hooves, his hands moved with the easy competence of a man used to handling good stock. Trained animals, responsive to voice commands, nothing like the half-broke mules that miners rode. And the boots. Rebecca noticed the boots on the second day. The coat was worn, patched at the elbows, deliberately aged. But the boots were sound and strong, good leather, resoled recently. The boots of a man who understood that you could fake poverty in everything except the thing that kept you on your feet. The mask was cracking. The surface said poor, but the details said something else. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" she asked, on the second evening by the fire. "Since I was born," Caleb said. He poked the fire with a stick. The coals rearranged themselves. It was a short answer, but Rebecca heard what lived inside it. A possessiveness. Not, "I've been up here a while," or "I came looking for work," since I was born. These mountains were his, but how they were his, and what that meant, he wasn't saying yet. On the 3rd morning, the land changed. Thick pines thinned into gray rock and scattered aspen, their white trunks bright against the slope. The wagon jolted over rough ground. More than once, Caleb climbed down to steady a wheel or walked beside the horses around a sharp turn. The wind came hard off the peaks, snapping at Rebecca's shawl. She studied him as he worked, every movement deliberate. His hands on the horse's harness, the particular grip of a man used to training, not just driving. When he paused to scan the ridges, his shoulders squared in a way that didn't look like a drifter hunting work. It looked like a man checking on something that already belonged to him. Late in the afternoon, they reached a narrow pass between 2 walls of stone. The sky beyond it glowed a softer blue. Caleb drew the team to a stop. The wagon swayed as he sat there with the reins in his hands, not moving, not speaking. Rebecca looked at him. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Fear. Not mountain fear, not the practical wariness of a man navigating cliffs and weather. Something else. The fear of a man who is about to show someone a thing that will change everything, and who doesn't know whether the change will be a gift or a loss. "The roughest part of the road is behind us," he said. His voice carried a tight edge she hadn't heard before. "But the next hill will change everything." "What will change?" Rebecca asked. He didn't answer. He tightened the reins and clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward through the pass. The trail bent around a cluster of twisted pines. And then the world opened. Below them lay a wide, hidden valley cupped by steep slopes and dark timber. A clear river cut through the middle, shining in the late light. Even this close to winter, patches of meadow still showed deep green, the particular living green of sheltered land, where the altitude and the surrounding peaks created their own weather, their own season, their own private piece of the world. But the valley was not empty. In the center rose a great fortress built of heavy logs and stone. Broad porches wrapped around it. Tall windows caught the shifting clouds. Smoke lifted from chimneys, multiple chimneys, the kind of chimney count that meant rooms, many rooms, rooms for purposes beyond simple shelter. Fences and barns spread out around it in neat lines. A drive swept from the front entrance toward the road where they stood. Workers moved in the distance. Small figures, purposeful, the choreography of a functioning operation. This was not the home of a poor mountain man. This was a holding, a seat of power, hidden in a valley that no road on any map would lead you to. Rebecca gripped the seat. Her heart pounded. The duty mask, the mask she'd worn from the moment she said, "I'll go with you," cracked. Because if this was his home, then everything she'd been told, everything she'd calculated, every equation she'd used to make peace with her decision was built on a foundation that didn't exist. She'd married a poor man for duty, but the man sitting beside her wasn't poor. "Whose place is this?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer, had known it since the boots, since the horses, since the way he scanned the ridges. Caleb's answer came quiet and steady. "Winter's Keep, my home." He turned to look at her, and the fear was still in his eyes. "And now yours." The words hit her harder than the cold wind. Before she could answer, before she could even begin to sort the tangle of shock and anger and something she refused to call relief, a tall man stepped out onto the front steps of the fortress. He wore clean work clothes and polished boots. He walked toward the wagon with the easy, sure stride of a man who had been waiting. He greeted Caleb by name, not Caleb, but Sir, and said they had been expecting him and that everything was ready inside. And in that moment, Caleb changed. His shoulders set, his chin lifted. The worn coat stayed the same, but the man inside it was no longer the quiet figure who'd sat on her father's porch rail and talked about the high country in a low voice. A calm authority settled over him, the authority of a man stepping back into a life he'd temporarily set aside, the way you set aside a coat. The poverty had been the costume. This was the man. Rebecca sat on the wagon seat, green hands gripping the rough wood, amber eyes wide, and watched the mask fall away from the person she'd married. The mask she'd thought she understood, the poor mountain man, the humble offer, the steady hands, had been exactly that, a mask. And underneath it was something she hadn't imagined, hadn't calculated, hadn't prepared for. Her duty mask was cracking. His poverty mask had just shattered. And between the two broken masks, the real question was forming. Who were they underneath? Inside the great hall, warm lamplight shone on paneled walls of dark timber. A stone fireplace, massive, the kind that took 2 men to stack the logs, roared at one end of a room that was larger than Rebecca's entire cabin. Soft rugs covered polished floors. Heavy tables and deep chairs filled the space with the particular weight of furniture built to last generations. Paintings of mountains and forests hung between tall windows that looked out over the valley in every direction. The air smelled of cedar, fresh bread, and clean soap, a trinity of scents that Rebecca associated with wealth, because in her world, clean soap was a luxury. Fresh bread meant an oven that worked properly. and cedar meant wood that had been chosen for beauty rather than function. She walked in slowly, afraid to touch anything. Her green hands, work-roughened, calloused, the hands of a woman who had spent her life pulling weeds from rocky soil and hauling sacks at the trading post, hung at her sides, unsure of their purpose in a room where nothing needed hauling or mending or holding together. A woman in a neat apron brought a tray with tea and thin white cups, porcelain, actual porcelain, with painted flowers on the rim. Rebecca wrapped her green fingers around one and almost didn't drink, afraid it might break in her hands. Orc grip was stronger than human grip. She'd learned that lesson with tin cups and wooden bowls. Porcelain was new territory. The servants watched her with careful curiosity. She felt their eyes, not hostile, but assessing. The master had brought an orc wife, green skin in the great hall. The implications of that were still being calculated behind polite faces and lowered eyes. When the servant stepped back, the room went quiet, except for the steady crackle of the fire. Caleb stood in front of her. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw fear in his blue eyes. Not fear of mountains or weather or creditors, but fear of losing what mattered. The fear of a man about to lay down his last card and discover whether the person across from him would stay at the table. "There are things I haven't said," he began, "not to trick you, because I needed to know who you truly were before I laid the full weight of my life in your hands." Rebecca stood very still. The porcelain cup was warm in her green fingers. The fire crackled. She waited. His true name was Caleb Winters. His father had built a timber empire, forests, mills, roads in this valley. When his father died, the business in Winters Keep passed to him. In the territory's capital, people saw only his money and his land. They flattered, they schemed. Some tried to tie him to their daughters with soft words and hollow hearts. Women whose families saw a fortune, not a man. Men whose handshakes came with contracts hidden in the grip. He had grown tired of it, tired of feeling like a prize rather than a person, tired of the particular exhaustion that comes from never knowing whether the face across from you is seeing you or seeing your account balance. So he'd gone into the high country in rough clothes, wearing the mask of a poor mountain man looking for someone who could see past the fortune to the person underneath. "I watched you in town," he said, hauling sacks, arguing for fair weight, standing between your family and everything that was trying to tear it apart. He paused. "And I thought, that woman doesn't need my money. She needs a partner. And I need someone who would choose me without knowing what I have." He looked at her. The fear was still there. "But there's something else I need to say," he continued. "In the capital, nobody would expect me to marry an orc woman. That's not why I chose you. I chose you because of what I saw at the trading post, the strength, the stubbornness, the way you held yourself when people tried to make you small. But I know the world will see it differently. I know what they'll say, and I know your mask has been thicker than mine." The word landed. "Mask? My mask," Rebecca said. "Duty," Caleb said. "You've been wearing it so long you've forgotten it's there. You came with me because of your family's debt. You said yes because you calculated the cost and decided you could bear it. That's not choice, Rebecca. That's survival wearing the face of choice." The silence that followed was the kind that has architecture, not empty, but structured, built from the things neither of them had said until now and the things they were both, in this moment, deciding whether to say. Rebecca set the porcelain cup down on the table. Carefully, it didn't break. "You hid who you are," she said. "You let me believe I was marrying a poor man. Yes, you let me make the hardest decision of my life based on incomplete information. Yes. And you want me to trust you now, after learning that the foundation I stood on was something you built to test me?" Caleb didn't flinch. "I want you to know the full truth, and then I want you to decide again, freely, with everything in front of you. If you choose not to stay, I'll keep my promise. Your father's debts will be settled. The cabin and the claim will stay in your family. You can walk out of this house and I'll have the wagon take you home in the morning." Rebecca turned toward the fire, watched the flames move over the logs, the slow, deliberate consumption of something solid, reducing it to heat, and light and ash. She thought of her father's cough, her brother and sister's thin arms, the little garden in rocky soil. She thought of the duty mask, the thing she'd put on years ago, when her mother died and the weight of the family settled onto her green shoulders, and she'd accepted it because someone had to, and she was the one who was there. She thought of this valley, strong and quiet and hidden, and the man standing behind her maskless for the first time, not the poor mountain man, not the wealthy timber heir, but a person who had done a wrong thing for a complicated reason, and who was standing in the consequences of it without trying to escape. Her heart hurt, but beneath the hurt she felt the same stubborn strength that had carried her through every hard year, the particular orc stubbornness that her mother had called mountain bone, the thing inside you that doesn't break because it was forged in conditions that would break everything else. She faced him. "I don't need a rich man," she said. "I came here because of duty, because my family's survival was the only equation I could solve. But you're right. Duty is a mask. I've been wearing it so long, I forgot I had a face underneath." She took a breath. "Now I know the truth. And I'm choosing, not calculating, not surviving, choosing to stay. Not because of the money or the house or the debts, because the man who sat on my father's porch and spoke plain and listened to the wind and didn't flinch at my skin, that man is real. The coat was fake. The man is real." She held his gaze. Together, whatever storms come, from the peaks or from the capital, together. Caleb's face changed, the fear draining out of it, replaced by something raw and grateful and careful, the expression of a man who has gambled everything on a stranger's character and has just learned that the gamble paid. Two masks broken on the floor of a great hall, one made of poverty, one made of duty, and underneath both, two people, one human, one orc, standing in the firelight seeing each other clearly for the first time. The first days at Winter's Keep passed in a blur of discovery. Rebecca learned the paths of the great fortress, the soft creak of its stairways, the way the valley held quiet like a blessing, the particular rhythm of a household that ran on the labor of many hands, and the authority of one name. She walked the grounds with Caleb. He showed her the mill road, the bunkhouses, the barns, the small school he'd begun for the workers' children. He listened when she asked questions about wages and housing, when she pointed out a drafty wall in the workers' quarters or a weak section of roof on the equipment shed. He didn't brush her aside. He wrote notes and told the foreman to see to it. The servants adjusted. Not instantly. The adjustment of a household staff to a new mistress takes time under any circumstances. And when the new mistress is orc, the calibration involves additional variables that nobody discusses openly, but everyone calculates privately. But Rebecca's particular talent, the same talent that had kept her family together through years of debt and difficulty, was the ability to be competent in a way that made competence the only thing worth noticing. She organized, she observed. She asked precise questions and remembered the answers. Within a week, the household staff had stopped seeing the green skin and started seeing the woman who knew when the flour delivery was short before the cook did. For a moment, she began to believe that this strange new life might find a steady shape. Then, on a sharp afternoon in the second week, a carriage rolled up the drive with too much polish and not enough dust. Dark horses stamped on the packed earth. A woman stepped out wrapped in a deep blue traveling cloak, her hair pinned as precisely as a surveyor's line, her gray eyes cold and sharp as a blade held up to light. Caleb went stiff beside Rebecca. He greeted the woman as his aunt, Catherine Winters. With her came two men in fine suits. Their boots were immaculate, their collars starched, and they wore the look of men who measured the world in profit and loss, and had never found the measurement wanting. Inside, the great room filled with voices that did not belong to the valley. Catherine looked Rebecca over from head to toe, not in a single glance, but in a slow, deliberate scan that missed nothing and communicated with surgical precision that what it found was insufficient. "A surprise," Catherine said. The word was pleasant. The delivery was not. "An orc, Caleb? You married an orc woman without consulting the board?" The word orc came out of Catherine's mouth the way certain words come out of certain mouths. Clean, precise, and carrying a payload of meaning that the syllable itself was too small to contain. It wasn't a slur. It was worse than a slur. It was a classification delivered with the particular calm of a woman who had organized the world into categories and did not appreciate having her categories disrupted. One of the suited men, the one with silver at his temples and the thinner smile, explained in careful, practiced tones that the Winters Timber Company was on the edge of something significant. There were offers on the table, contracts for expansion, plans that could triple their wealth if they cleared more forest, opened more roads, and partnered with investors from back east. For such an endeavor, Caleb must present the proper image, a solid, respectable marriage to a woman suited for capital society. Someone from a known family with polished manners, someone with, and here the man paused, selecting his words with the particular care of a person choosing which knife to use, the appropriate bearing. Appropriate bearing meant human skin. Everyone in the room understood this. The phrase was a door through which the real meaning walked. Wearing a suit. Catherine pressed each word like a weight. We cannot risk the company's future for a marriage made in the backwoods. Not when the stakes are this high. And certainly not, she let her gaze rest on Rebecca's hands, folded in her lap. Green hands, strong hands, hands with calluses and short nails, and the particular roughness of a life spent working. Certainly not for someone whose qualifications begin and end with survival. Rebecca felt the sting of those words, each one placed with intention, each one designed to find the gap between her armor plates. But she kept her chin lifted and her amber eyes steady because she had been receiving words like these her entire life. And the particular gift of growing up orc in a human town was that you developed calluses in places other people didn't know could callus. Caleb stepped closer to Rebecca. She is my wife, he said. My choice. Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. Choices have consequences, Caleb. The board will not risk this company's future for a marriage made in sentiment. That night, Rebecca lay awake in a room that felt far too grand for sleep. Through the window, the valley lay washed in silver light, peaceful still. But inside these walls, something sharp was forming. The aunt had arrived with a blade, and the blade was still being sharpened. In the morning, Rebecca went looking for Caleb and heard raised voices behind a half-open door. Catherine's tone cut through the hall. Unsuitable, untrained, a burden that will drag you down in every salon and boardroom in the territory. And an orc. Caleb, an orc. Do you have any idea what the Eastbrook investors will say when they learn? I will not trade my wife for contracts. Caleb's voice came rough with anger. I am not a piece on a board to be moved for someone else's gain. Sentiment makes men weak, Catherine said, and weakness ruins empires. You're destroying everything your father built for an orc woman who can barely read a contract. Rebecca could have slipped away. She'd spent her life being discussed in rooms she wasn't in, assessed by people who hadn't asked her name, categorized by a single adjective, orc, that they treated as a complete description. She could have retreated down the hall and waited for the argument to end, and made her peace with whatever outcome the powerful people in the room decided on her behalf. Something inside her refused. She stepped into the doorway. Both of them turned. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was not. If you're going to weigh me like a bolt of cloth, she said, I have the right to stand on the scale. Catherine's brows rose. This is business, dear. If you truly care for Caleb, if I truly cared for Caleb, I'd step aside? That's what you're going to say? Rebecca walked into the room. Green skin in a room of dark wood and expensive fabric. Amber eyes locked on gray. What Caleb needs is not a perfect hostess. It's someone who will stand beside him when people try to tear his home apart. I've been doing that since I was 11. I've just been doing it with a cabin instead of a fortress. The room went very still. Caleb looked at her with something like awe, the particular expression of a man who has placed a bet on someone's character and is watching it pay off in real time. Catherine's eyes cooled to a temperature that would have made the mountain winter feel warm. There is one simple way to see whether you can stand the pressure of Caleb's world, Catherine said. The governor's reception in the capital is 1 week away. Every powerful man and woman in the territory will be there. If you can walk into that room, hold your head up, and not crumble, I will at least listen. It was not a kind offer. It was a test designed to break her. An orc woman in a ballroom full of the territory's most influential humans, under the chandelier light that would make her green skin impossible to ignore. Catherine was betting that the pressure would crack Rebecca the way mountain rock cracks in a freeze, from the inside. After Catherine left, the anger in Caleb's face softened into worry. He told Rebecca she didn't have to accept. He would fight his aunt and the board without dragging her into the capital's games. Rebecca looked down at her work-rough hands, then out the window, toward the mountains. "The fight has already come to me," she said. "Catherine has already dragged my name through every parlor and meeting room she can reach. Running won't change that. Better to walk into the light and let them see me clearly than hide in shadows while they tear me apart in whispers." She turned to him. "If there's going to be a battle for our marriage and for this valley, I want to stand in it, not watch from the edge." Caleb saw there was no shifting her. He promised that whatever waited in the capital, they would face it together. They spent the next days preparing. A seamstress came up to the keep and worked long hours in Rebecca's room, cutting and stitching a gown that felt like a bridge between worlds. Forest green silk, the color of the pines, the color of Rebecca's skin in certain light. Simple lines that allowed her to move and breathe, because Rebecca would not wear a cage, no matter how beautiful the fabric. Servants coached her on the basics of formal dining and the dance steps the capital favored. She practiced walking in new shoes on the long hall, learning how to glide without tripping on the hem. It was, she thought, considerably easier than walking a loaded mule down a mountain path in the rain, which she had done many times without anyone offering her lessons. Caleb went over papers late into the night, contracts, board notes, correspondence, mapping out how much power Catherine truly had and where their chances lay. When they climbed into the coach bound for the capital, the valley lay behind them in clear, cold light. Rebecca watched Winter's Keep shrink against the mountains and silently promised it she would come back stronger. The capital was busy and loud. Wagons jammed the streets. Brick buildings leaned over sidewalks. People flowed in coats and hats of every cut. The coach pulled up in front of a grand hotel with tall windows and carved stone arches. Inside, the smell of perfume and polished wood wrapped around her. Men in sharp suits talked in low tones. Women moved in bright silk, their voices light and quick. For a heartbeat, Rebecca felt small. An orc mountain woman dropped into a world that didn't want her. Then, Caleb's hand closed around hers. Warm against cool. Human against orc. "You've faced hunger and blizzards and men with cold eyes," he said. "You've stood between a storm and the people you love. These people have never heard a wolf cry across open snow. They've never faced anything that couldn't be solved with money. You have nothing to fear from them that you haven't already faced in harder form." Later, as evening fell, they stood outside the ballroom doors. Music drifted through the crack. Servants moved in and out, carrying trays that glittered with glass. A man waited to announce their names. Catherine was already inside, turning heads, planting stories with every smile. Rebecca drew a full breath and lifted her chin. On the other side of those doors waited judges, enemies, and maybe unexpected allies. The fate of her marriage and the future of Winter's Keep would be shaped by what happened in that room. With Caleb at her side and mountains in her heart, she gave a small nod to the doorman and stepped forward into the light. The tall doors opened. Light from the chandeliers spilled over polished floors in bright silk. The man at the entrance called Caleb's name, Caleb Winters, Winters Timber, and the name rolled across the room. Heads turned toward the man in a plain black coat and the young orc woman beside him in a dress the color of pine after rain. Green skin under chandelier light, amber eyes in a room of crystal and gold. For one terrible, beautiful second, the entire ballroom saw her, really saw her, and the seeing was a thing that had weight. Rebecca wanted to turn around. The air smelled of perfume and roasted meat. Diamonds flashed. No one here knew about thin gardens, cracked mirrors, or mountain wind that cut through every coat. They knew ledgers and railroads and power. Her heart pounded, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward on Caleb's arm. Catherine appeared from the crowd in deep red silk, gray eyes, sharp over a smooth smile. She greeted Caleb warmly, then let her gaze travel over Rebecca. "A mountain orc girl can be made almost presentable with enough work," she said, loud enough to carry. Women smirked behind their fans, the particular smirk of people who have been given permission to be cruel by someone with more authority than them. Rebecca thanked her for sending the dressmaker and said she cared more about strong cloth and straight seams than fancy ruffles. The words were simple. They did not bend. One or two men hid quick smiles. A thin line appeared at the corner of Catherine's mouth. Catherine brought forward the tall investor, silver at his temples, polished manners, the look of a man who could buy and sell everything Rebecca had ever known without checking his balance. He praised progress and jobs and spoke of fortunes to be made in the high country. Then he turned to Rebecca with a pleasant look that never reached his eyes and asked if someone from— he paused, selecting his phrasing— a small mountain settlement could really understand such plans. An orc woman, he meant. Everyone heard what he meant. Rebecca thought of hills stripped bare, brown water, cabins taken by slides when the trees that held the slopes were gone. In a steady voice, she said she understood what happened when too many trees came down too fast. She talked about springs that turned muddy, roads that washed away, families who paid the price when storms hit cut land. "I know the mountain," she said. "I've lived my life on it. Orc eyes read the forest's health better than any ledger can." She did not raise her voice. She simply laid down what she had seen with her own eyes, the testimony of a woman whose knowledge came from living on the land rather than owning it, and whose green hands had pulled weeds from soil that men in suits had never touched. The small circle went quiet. The investor's smile thinned. Into that silence stepped another voice, warm and sure. The governor had come close enough to listen. He greeted Caleb, then took Rebecca's hand with respect. Green hand, firm grip, no flinch. "The territory needs people who know the high country the way you do," he said. "Please, keep talking." They spoke for several minutes while listeners drew closer. Rebecca talked about fair wages, safer camps, cutting timber in a way that left strong forest standing for the next generation. The governor listened and agreed more than once. The feel of the room shifted, not completely, not permanently, but enough. Men who had ignored her now watched with careful interest. An orc woman in a green dress was teaching a room full of powerful humans about the land they claimed to own. Catherine stood at the edge of the circle, eyes cold and hard. She slipped away to a knot of serious faces near the wall. When she returned, an older judge walked beside her carrying a worn leather folder. Catherine's smile was bright and sharp, a blade polished for display. She announced that the judge had reviewed certain family documents and found a serious concern about Caleb's recent marriage that the board could not ignore. The judge opened the folder. He explained that Caleb's inheritance came with strict terms. Any marriage that might threaten the company's stability could be challenged by the board. Certain approvals, he said, had not been filed. In his view, the union did not fully meet the will's conditions. Nearby guests fell silent, hungry for scandal, ready to watch the orc woman fall. The words hit Rebecca like cold water, but they did not knock her down. She had been reading documents by lantern light since she was 14. Claim notices, debt letters, bank demands, the particular cramped handwriting of institutions that communicated power through complexity. "May I see the document?" she asked. The judge, surprised, an orc woman asking to read legal papers, handed it to her. She read each line slowly, carefully. Her finger followed the cramped writing the way it had followed 100 claim notices in her father's cabin. Around her, the ballroom watched. An orc woman in a green dress reading a legal document in a chandelier-lit room while a judge and a society matron waited for her to give up. She did not give up. She found what she needed. The clause did not only speak about risk, It also said that a marriage could be defended if it strengthened the company's standing through public service to the territory and its people. Rebecca asked the judge to confirm that part. He did, less sure of himself now, his voice not quite as loud, his authority quietly deflating in the face of a woman who had actually read the document instead of accepting his summary. She turned to the governor. Would acting as a voice for mountain families and advising on fair timber laws count as service, in your view? The governor studied her for a long second. The room held its breath. 100 powerful people watching an orc woman ask a constitutional question in a ballroom. I've already been considering such a role, the governor said, and your words tonight have settled it. He asked Rebecca to accept an unpaid appointment as an advisor on high country matters. A secretary stepped forward with a short letter bearing the territorial seal. Rebecca's hand trembled only once as she signed, green fingers on the pen, her name in careful strokes on a document that carried the weight of a government. The judge cleared his throat and admitted that her new standing removed any legal question the board might raise. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Catherine's face went pale, then stiff. The blade she had sharpened for weeks had turned in her hand. Caleb stepped to Rebecca's side. He thanked the officials with measured words. Then he turned to his aunt in a low tone that carried only far enough. My marriage is no longer yours to touch. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she looked like she might argue, but there was nothing she could say that would not make her look small in front of the governor, the judge, and half the powerful people in the territory. She turned and walked back into the crowd alone, the bright silk of her dress moving like a retreating banner. Later, on the hotel balcony, the city lights below them looked like scattered embers in a dying fire. The air was cold and clean, mountain air carried down from the peaks, even here in the city, a reminder that the wild was never as far away as civilization liked to believe. Rebecca felt the strain of the night, the particular exhaustion that comes from performing courage for hours without a break, from holding your chin up when every instinct says lower it, from standing in a room of people who wanted you to fail and refusing to give them the satisfaction. Caleb stood beside her. His hands rested on the railing. His coat was the same one he'd worn in the mountains, the worn one, the patched one, the mask he'd created and then shed. He'd worn it tonight in the ballroom among silk and diamonds, and nobody had said a word about it because the coat no longer mattered. The man inside it had proved, through the woman at his side, that the coat was the least important thing about him. I thought I was bringing you into my world, he said quietly. Tonight I watched you stand in front of it, orc woman, human ballroom, and not bend. Rebecca looked at the lights. I was afraid every moment. I know, but everything I was afraid of. The looks, the words, the test. I've faced all of it before, in harder form. She almost smiled. Instead of chandeliers, there were wolves. Instead of investors, there were creditors. Instead of your aunt, there was winter. Winter's worse, Caleb said. Winter's worse, Rebecca agreed. And they laughed together. The first real laugh they'd shared. Not careful, not measured, not filtered through masks or duty, or the particular guardedness of two people who had married as strangers and were still learning each other's edges. A real laugh, in the cold air, on a balcony, with a city below them and a mountain valley waiting above. It lasted only a moment, but the moment changed something. The way a single degree of temperature change can shift ice to water, the invisible line between one state and another, crossed without drama but with permanent consequence. They were no longer strangers wearing masks. They were partners who had stood in the same room and fought the same fight and survived it together. And the surviving had stripped away the last of the pretense, the way mountain weather strips paint from wood, leaving the grain exposed. Rough, honest, real. They rode home to Winter's Keep a few days later. When the hidden valley opened beneath them and the fortress came into view, smoke from chimneys, the river shining, the meadows deep green even in the approaching winter, it looked the same, but it wasn't the same. It was no longer Caleb's secret refuge. It was their shared work, and the distinction between those two things, a man's hiding place versus a couple's home, was the difference between surviving and building, between enduring and choosing. Changes came one by one, not dramatic. The most permanent changes never are. They come in the accumulation of ordinary mornings and ordinary decisions, the way a river shapes a canyon, not by force, but by showing up every day. The workers' cabins were rebuilt stronger. Rebecca used the knowledge her father had passed down, not mining knowledge, but the structural understanding that comes from living in buildings that fail, from patching roofs that leak, from understanding which joints hold and which ones give. Her hands, green, strong, calloused, held a hammer the way they held everything, with the particular competence of a woman who had never had the luxury of incompetence. A schoolhouse opened near the mill road. Rebecca had insisted, not demanded, insisted with the quiet persistence that Caleb had learned to recognize as unmovable. The workers' children needed reading and arithmetic. Some of them were orc children, or half-orc, from the families that worked the lower operations. For the first time, they sat in a schoolroom where the person who'd built it looked like them. A trail medic was hired, a woman from the settlements who knew herbs and wounds and the particular injuries that timber work produced. Winter sickness and cutting accidents no longer meant a 3-day ride to the nearest physician. At board meetings, Caleb fought for better practices. Catherine's allies still sat on the board, men who saw forests as numbers and mountains as obstacles, but the governor's endorsement had shifted the balance. When officials rode up from the capital to inspect the operation, Rebecca met them on the front steps of Winter's Keep, an orc woman in practical clothes, standing at the door of a timber empire, and walked them through the forests herself. She knew the trees. She'd grown up under them. She knew which slopes held water, which ridgelines broke the wind, where the elk crossed in autumn and where the springs emerged in spring. Orc eyes, she told the ballroom, read the forest's health better than any ledger. She'd meant it, and when she walked the inspectors through the stands, pointing out the sections where careful cutting had left strong forest and the sections where the old methods had left bare scars, the inspectors wrote favorable reports, and the board had no argument that could outweigh them. Trees still fell. The company still made money, but new ones were planted. Crews learned to leave strong stands on the slopes instead of bare ground. The operation ran on land that could still breathe, and the breathing meant that the land would be productive next year and the year after that, which was a form of wealth that Catherine's investment friends, with their quarterly thinking, had never been able to see. Catherine never again tried to undo the marriage. Time and distance wore at her plans. Stories drifted up from the capital that some of her schemes had failed, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that schemes fail when the foundation they were built on shifts. The governor's appointment had shifted it. Rebecca's presence at inspections had shifted it. The simple, persistent fact of an orc woman running a successful operation in the high country had shifted it, not by being loud or dramatic, but by being competent, day after day, in a way that made competence the only thing worth discussing. Seasons turned. Children's laughter began to fill the halls of Winter's Keep. Sounds that the fortress hadn't held before. Sounds that changed the texture of the rooms the way sunlight changes the texture of stone. The great room fire burned warm on winter nights while Caleb and Rebecca sat side by side, planning the next season instead of fearing the next storm. Sometimes when the wind rushed through the pines and the valley held its particular deep quiet, Rebecca stood on the wide front porch and listened. She remembered the thin garden behind her father's failing cabin, cold soil, rocky ground, green hands pulling weeds, the cracked mirror in the loft, the tired orc woman looking back, the knock at midnight, the man with frost in his beard, and a mask she didn't know he was wearing. The rough wagon on the narrow trail climbing the moment the valley opened and the fortress appeared, and her entire understanding of what she'd agreed to shattered like ice on a spring creek. She remembered the great hall, the porcelain cup she was afraid to hold, the confession, the masks, his and hers, falling to the floor in the firelight. She remembered Catherine's cold eyes and the word orc delivered like a verdict. The seamstress, the green silk, the new shoes on the long hall, the ballroom doors opening, chandelier light on green skin, the investor's thin smile, the governor's handshake, green hand, firm grip, no flinch. She remembered the legal document, her finger tracing cramped lines while a room full of powerful people waited for her to give up. And the moment she found the clause that Catherine hadn't expected an Orc Mountain woman to find, and turned it like a blade in her hand. She remembered the balcony, the laugh, the moment the masks were finally completely gone, and she remembered what Caleb had said 3 days into the mountains as the wagon approached the pass. The next hill will change everything. He'd been right. Everything had changed, but not the way either of them had expected. The change wasn't the fortress, or the money, or the timber empire. The change was simpler and more profound than any of those things. She had married a man she believed was a poor mountain guardian, wearing a duty mask so tight it had become her face. He had chosen her wearing a poverty mask he'd built to find someone who could see past it. Both masks had fallen, and underneath the duty and the poverty and the fear and the calculation, were 2 people who fit. Not because they were the same. They weren't. Human and orc, wealth and poverty, power and stubbornness. They fit because the things that mattered were the same. The willingness to stand in a storm, the refusal to bend when the bending was expected, the particular courage of choosing someone, not because the math worked out, but because the person was real. Rebecca looked at her hands on the porch railing. Green, strong, calloused from a life that had never been easy and had never made her soft. The same hands that had gripped a porcelain cup in terror and a legal document in defiance and a governor's pen in determination. The same hands that had taken Caleb's on the morning she left her father's cabin, cool against warm, orc against human, a temperature difference that neither of them had mentioned and both of them had felt. The same hands, different world, same woman inside them. She had been wearing a duty mask when she climbed onto that wagon. She had taken it off in a firelit room when she chose to stay, not for the money, not for the debts, not for the family she was saving, but for the man who had been real underneath his own disguise. 2 masks, 2 people, 1 valley. And in the years that followed, when the wind came down from the peaks and moved through the pines of Winter's Keep, it carried a sound that hadn't been there before. The sound of a home that was lived in rather than hidden in, a business that was built to last rather than strip and leave, a marriage that had started as a transaction and become a partnership, and a woman whose green hands had held together a family, a fortress, and a future that no one, not Catherine, not the board, not the polished men in the capital had believed she could carry. She carried it the way she'd carried everything. With mountain bone, with stubborn grace, with the particular strength of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had used every underestimation as fuel. The mountains kept their silence, but inside that silence a life was built, of courage, of loyalty, and of the deep, steady love that comes not from perfection but from the willingness to stand in the truth of who you are, masks off and let someone see you. Both of them had done that. Both of them had been afraid, and both of them had stayed.